Dr. Bill Linder groaned as he dragged a suitcase up the stairs of his house in Columbus, Ohio. It was June of 1990, and the 43-year-old doctor had just returned from a family trip to Israel with his 2 teenage daughters. The vacation had gone smoothly until one of their relatives got seriously ill. Bill's wife stayed behind to care for their family member while Bill and the kids returned back home. As he struggled to get his heavy luggage up each step, Bill could hear his daughters, 15-year-old Jocelyn and 16-year-old Hillary, running down to the basement to watch a movie. He couldn't believe they could keep their eyes open. After a 2-week trip, an international flight, and a long drive home from the airport, he felt exhausted. When he finally reached the upper landing, Bill headed straight to his room and collapsed into bed. But as soon as he took off his socks, he noticed his ankles looked swollen. Bill wondered if he'd accidentally injured his ankles by walking too much on vacation, but when he felt around the joints for sore spots, they didn't hurt. So Bill figured the swelling must be a result of too much sitting during the long international flight. Bill stood up and walked into his bathroom and grabbed a bottle of diuretic pills out of his medicine cabinet. He took one, hoping it might reduce the fluid buildup in his body. Then Bill crawled back into bed, desperate for a nap. Less than an hour later, Bill woke up. He still felt tired, but it was getting close to dinner time, and he knew his daughters needed to eat. So he threw the covers back and got out of bed. Bill walked out of his bedroom, intending to walk down to the kitchen, but as he stood at the top of the stairs, he started to feel lightheaded. His vision went blurry and his ears began to ring. He reached out to grab the stair railing for support, but he missed, and instead of catching himself, he fell face first into the metal rail. For a moment, everything went black. Then Bill heard Jocelyn and Hillary running up the stairs, followed by their frantic voices asking if he was okay. Bill slowly opened his eyes. He realized he was lying at the top of the stairs, and he felt this warm, wet liquid dripping down his temple. He touched the side of his head, and when he looked at his fingers, he saw they were covered in blood. He turned to his side and saw both of his daughters staring at him, their eyes wide with terror. Bill slowly stood up, holding onto the railing this time, and promised Jocelyn and Hillary that he was okay. His head was just throbbing from hitting the railing, but other than that, he felt okay. He said he must have just gotten up too fast. The girls insisted on taking Bill to see one of the doctors at his family practice. Bill didn't want to leave the house, but he figured if a quick checkup would put his daughters' minds at ease, then it was worth it. When they got to the family clinic a few minutes later, Bill could tell his colleagues were shocked to see him with dried blood caked onto his cheek. Luckily, the visit was short. The physician on duty cleaned Bill up, gave him 7 stitches, and then just sent him home. 2 years later, in the summer of 1992, Bill and his favorite nurse, whose name was Kim, were closing up the family clinic for the day. Bill had not had any more health scares since his fall 2 years earlier, so in that time he'd just been focusing on spending time with his family and continuing to expand his medical practice. Though it was getting close to dinner time, Bill did not need to rush home. His wife Rhoda was out of town, and the girls were going out with their friends. So he and Kim took their time wiping down countertops and restocking the exam rooms, chatting and drinking a couple of beers that Bill had stashed in the office refrigerator. Bill and Kim finally headed out to the parking lot at about 7 p.m. And as the two of them walked across the concrete, Bill suddenly started to feel short of breath. He'd only gone a few dozen yards, but he felt like he'd just sprinted a mile. He stood still and tried to stop panting, but inhaling just kept getting harder and harder. Kim put her hand on his shoulder and gave him a very concerned look. Bill turned to her and just said, "I need to go to the hospital." Kim sped Bill to the nearest emergency room, and when they got there, Kim helped Bill shuffle up to the front desk. In between labored breaths, he told the receptionist that he could barely breathe, but since he was a doctor, he knew what he needed. He asked to have a chest x-ray as soon as possible. Less than an hour later, Bill was lying on a hard bed in a hospital room, still struggling to inhale while Kim coached him through each breath. Finally, a radiologist entered the room with the x-ray results, and Kim helped Bill sit up so he could see. But what Bill saw on the x-ray film seemed impossible. Normally, lungs appear dark on an x-ray, but Bill's looked white. Now, Bill was not a lung specialist, but he'd known since medical school that this was a sign of fluid building up around the lungs. In severe cases, there can be so much liquid in the chest cavity, the lungs can't inflate properly, making it difficult or even impossible to breathe. Looking at the x-ray, Bill felt genuinely frightened. Now he understood why he was so short of breath. But what he didn't understand was why all this fluid was building up in the first place. It usually only occurred in patients who were elderly or extremely sick with things like pneumonia or cancer. Bill was 45 years old and careful about his health. He watched what he ate, exercised every day. He had no chronic illnesses, and so this just didn't make sense. Bill asked the radiologist what could be causing this, and the young woman said she didn't know. They would need to run tests to find the source of the fluid. Right now, the best thing they could do was just drain the liquid out of his chest cavity using a procedure called tapping. Bill dreaded the sound of that word. He knew exactly what tapping was, but he had never thought he'd have to experience it himself. It was a crude, unpleasant procedure, and the worst part was, Bill would be wide awake for the entire thing. Half an hour later, Bill was sitting shirtless on the edge of his hospital bed while the attending physician sat on a stool beside him. She disinfected Bill's back, then injected a local anesthetic near the rear of his ribcage. Bill's back quickly went numb, but that did not make him feel any less afraid, and so he reached out for Kim, who was still there to support him. Bill wanted to close his eyes for the next part, but he was too terrified to look away. He watched as the physician brought a long, thick needle towards his back. Then he felt a dull pressure as she plunged this needle between his ribs and pushed it deep into the space surrounding his lungs. Then the attending physician attached the opposite end of this needle to a thin tube, which led to a clear plastic container. As Bill squeezed Kim's hand and tried to relax, liquid began to drain out of his chest. Bill hoped the liquid would be clear or tan, because those were the most common colors of fluid in the chest cavity, and he didn't want to see any red tint, which could mean he was bleeding internally. But the fluid Bill saw coming out of his back and going up this tube was not clear, tan, or red. It was a thick, milky, yellowy substance that reminded him of the filling inside of a lemon meringue pie. He sat there watching this weird, gross liquid flow through the tube until an entire liter had been drained from the area surrounding his lungs. Finally, Bill felt a dull ache as the attending physician removed the needle and then covered the puncture hole with a bandage. Bill released his grip on Kim's hand and then asked the attending physician, what just came out of my body? What was that? She told him that the thick, milky fluid he was seeing was known as chyle, which is a mixture that includes fluids from the body's immune system. When a person has an infection, these fluids will flood the infected area, but they normally disappear after the infection is gone. The doctor told Bill that his body was not draining these fluids correctly, and it was causing a fluid buildup known as lymphedema. Now that Bill thought about it, lymphedema could explain the swelling problems that he had been experiencing for years. He'd thought that his badly swollen ankles a couple of years ago were caused by the long flight home from Israel, but now he realized it could be from something much worse. Because it wasn't just swelling in his legs and ankles. His body was leaking fluids into the space around his lungs, which was really baffling. His doctor agreed that chyle should never leak into the body like this. She said she had only ever seen that happen in cases of liver failure, certain cancers, and in heart disease. When the doctor mentioned heart disease, Bill remembered something. As a child, he'd been diagnosed with a heart murmur, a tiny sound that indicated a serious problem with his heart. Bill had undergone open heart surgery to correct the murmur when he was just 12 years old. Since the operation, Bill had not had any cardiac problems, but now he wondered, could his childhood illness be connected to the symptoms he was experiencing as an adult? The physician said it was possible, but she also told him not to panic. They wouldn't be able to determine exactly what was happening until he underwent a series of tests. Until then, he should just stay calm and not jump to any conclusions. Bill promised he would try, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his heart could be failing him. Over a year later, in 1994, Bill held onto his wife's arms as she slowly lowered him into the bathtub inside their room at a Boston hotel where they had been staying for months. They were visiting the doctors who had treated Bill's heart as a child, plus many more specialists throughout the city. They were hoping to find someone who'd be able to make sense of Bill's bizarre symptoms. While Bill's wife, Rhoda, scrubbed his aching back with a sponge, Bill thought about all the tests he'd undergone. Multiple cardiologists had examined his heart, and they had all said the same thing, that it was functioning totally normally. So whatever was happening to him, it couldn't have anything to do with his heart or with the surgery he'd undergone as a child. There was also nothing wrong with his kidneys or his liver or his immune system. What's more, he didn't appear to have cancer. Based on the test results, Bill should have been perfectly healthy. But he wasn't. The space around his lungs continued to fill with chyle, making every breath a struggle. His back was scarred from repeated tapping procedures to drain the fluid. Bill looked down at his stomach, which had become round and hard as a rock. This was a relatively new symptom, but it bothered him the most. Doctors told him that his stomach, his gut, was also filling up with chyle, which was even more worrisome than what was happening with his lungs. There were other alarming developments too. When Bill ate, the protein and fat in his food was not being processed correctly. Instead, it was leaking out of his intestines and mixing with his blood and other fluids. These were the ingredients in the chyle that kept building up inside of his body. As a doctor himself, Bill knew how serious this was. It meant that his body was not getting the nutrients it needed. With his wife's help, Bill climbed out of the bath, put on his pajamas, and got into bed. He closed his eyes, feeling absolutely miserable, and did his best to sleep. A few hours later, Bill woke up shivering and covered in sweat. He knew he must have a fever, so he shook his wife's shoulder to wake her up. Rhoda took one look at him and said they needed to go to the hospital right now. Bill held on to his wife as she helped him hobble out to the car, and then before he knew it, they were already at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Bill was too feverish and confused to check in, so he collapsed into a waiting room chair while his wife spoke with the receptionist. A few minutes later, a nurse brought Bill a wheelchair and wheeled him down the hall. By the time they made it to the examination room, Bill could barely speak and his vision was blurry. He was vaguely aware of a doctor coming in to examine him, and then he heard that doctor say that Bill would need to go to the intensive care unit. Bill turned his head to the side. Through the haze of his vision, he could see his wife anxiously holding her hands in front of her chest. He tried to wave to her as if to tell her everything is going to be okay, but he was too weak to even lift his hand. Early the next morning, one of Bill and Rhoda's daughters, Jocelyn, walked through the large glass doors of Brigham and Women's Hospital. Jocelyn was now 19 years old and a college student right here in the Boston area. She'd been up very late the night before, but the moment her mom called her and told her that her dad was in the hospital, she'd gotten out of bed early and driven straight here from her dorm room. Despite her exhaustion, Jocelyn's nerves had her all wound up. She couldn't stop thinking about her father's illness, and she constantly felt anxious. She'd been skipping classes lately and partying too much, doing her best to distract herself from her dad's problems. When Jocelyn walked inside of her father's room, she saw her dad lying on the hospital bed with tubes coming out of his arms, and it made her feel even worse. He looked old and frail. She gave him a gentle hug and then sat down on the couch next to her mom and her older sister. Jocelyn's mother explained to her that her father had contracted a staph infection, which is a dangerous type of bacterial infection in the blood. He had likely gotten it during one of his many tests or fluid draining procedures. Jocelyn sighed. Her dad was already so sick, and this felt like one more health problem to add to the list. It felt like they were all just kind of waiting around powerlessly, praying for something to change. Just then, Jocelyn heard the door to the room creak open, and in walked her great-aunt, whose name was Joni. Joni lived in New York, and so the family did not see her much. But Joni skipped past the usual greetings, and instead she walked right up to Bill's hospital bed and held out a dusty 3-ring binder. Joni said she knew what was wrong with Bill. She said that she had seen all of his symptoms before in her own husband, Bill's uncle. All the proof was right here in the binder she had brought. Jocelyn nearly jumped out of her seat. Maybe Joni really was carrying the breakthrough the family had been hoping for. Jocelyn assumed her father would be excited too, but he immediately waved Joni off. He told her that the two cases were not similar at all, and so he didn't want to hear anything else about his Uncle Nathan. Confused, Jocelyn pulled her great-aunt out of the room and into the hallway and asked to look at the binder. Jocelyn realized these were her great-uncle's medical records. Nathan had died over 30 years earlier in 1961, and these documents detailed the illness that killed him. Jocelyn's great-uncle Nathan had suffered from lymphedema, or swelling, in his ankles, just like Jocelyn's father. Doctors also reported heavy chyle buildup in Nathan's chest and abdomen that needed to be drained repeatedly from his body. He'd even been diagnosed with a heart murmur. To Jocelyn, it did all sound very similar to her father's condition. When Jocelyn looked back up at her great-aunt, Joni seemed kind of apologetic. She said her husband Nathan had died a very long and painful death, and so she assumed that Bill refused to believe he might have the same condition because he couldn't bear to imagine dying the same way. Jocelyn nodded somberly, but inside, she was thinking that this information could be the key to actually helping her father. She told her great aunt they needed to show these records to her father's doctors right away. The same day that Bill was admitted to the ICU, Dr. Christine Seidman was eating lunch in her office at Brigham and Women's Hospital. As she ate a forkful of leftovers, another doctor came inside and placed a 3-ring binder on her desk. They said it had to do with an ICU patient named Dr. Bill Linder. Dr. Seidman swallowed her food and then tucked her short black hair behind her ears. She looked over the documents while her colleague briefed her on Bill's condition. They explained the striking similarities between Bill's symptoms and his uncle's. Dr. Seidman immediately knew this case was right up her alley. In addition to being a cardiologist, she was a geneticist. Dr. Seidman knew that if anyone could solve this mystery illness, it was her. She jumped up from her desk and headed to the ICU. A few months later, in early 1995, Jocelyn sat on an exam table in the Brigham and Women's Hospital as Dr. Seidman rubbed cold gel across her skin and then pressed an ultrasound scanner against Jocelyn's chest. Dr. Seidman was performing something called an echocardiogram, or an ultrasound scan of Jocelyn's heart. The pressure of the plastic scanner hurt, but Jocelyn was too anxious about what the scan might reveal to worry about the pain. Ever since Dr. Seidman began looking into Bill's illness, she had been working closely with Jocelyn and the rest of the Linder family. Her goal was obviously to cure Bill, but to do that, she first had to identify his condition. She'd interviewed the Linder family and collected medical records going back generations, and she'd kept Jocelyn up to date on all her research, which was why Jocelyn knew how important this scan was. Dr. Seidman found that Jocelyn's father and great-uncle were not the only ones who suffered from this mystery illness. Jocelyn's great-grandmother, May, had had it too. The disease appeared to be hereditary, which meant it was getting passed down generation to generation. When Dr. Seidman had called Jocelyn in for this appointment, she explained that all 3 of Jocelyn's relatives who had dealt with this mystery illness, so her dad, great-uncle, and great-grandmother, had the same symptom first, a heart murmur. The doctors who had been treating Bill until now thought his childhood heart condition was totally irrelevant. But Dr. Seidman had discovered that it was actually the telltale sign of the mystery family disease. Jocelyn watched Dr. Seidman stare intently at the ultrasound screen. Then the doctor turned to Jocelyn, and with a pained expression on her face, she said Jocelyn did have a heart murmur. It was not a guarantee that Jocelyn would eventually develop the family disease, but there was now a very strong chance that she could. Jocelyn imagined her own body filling up with all that chyle the way her father's was, and tears began to well up in her eyes as she watched the black and white image of her heart beating on the screen. Normally, a heartbeat was a sign of life, but to Jocelyn, her heartbeat looked like a death sentence. Almost a year later, near the end of 1995, Bill sat inside of a room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital in Columbus. His condition had only gotten worse, and because doctors in Boston had not been able to help him, he and his wife Rhoda decided to go back home to Columbus. However, even though they were now closer to their house, Bill rarely spent a night in his own bed. He was almost always in one hospital or another. That day, Bill was hooked up to an IV that pumped vitamins and minerals into his bloodstream. His mystery illness had been stealing proteins and fats from his digestive system for almost 3 years, and so he now had to have this injection of nutrients twice a day in order to get the nutrients he needed. Bill looked down at his scab-covered arms from all the needles, his swollen ankles, and his huge, rounded stomach. He was in the worst shape of his life, physically and mentally. Bill knew that Dr. Seidman was trying to identify his illness and find a cure, and he had held out hope that she would. But now, he was just worried about the rest of his family. Dr. Seidman had told Bill that a total of 13 people in his family were likely to develop this disease, including both of his daughters. Now, Bill didn't only have to deal with his own horrible and confusing illness, he also had to deal with the knowledge that he might have passed it on to both of his kids. Suddenly, a knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and a tall man with gray hair and a clean-shaven face entered. He introduced himself as Dr. Larry Lynn. Dr. Lynn sat down beside Bill's bed. He explained that he was a pulmonologist or a lung expert, but more than that, he was obsessed with medical mysteries. He told Bill that he spent his free time digging through the hospital's records for inexplicable cases, and he'd happened upon Bill's file. Bill was skeptical. He asked Dr. Lin how many medical mysteries he'd been able to actually solve so far, and with a smirk, Dr. Lin replied, "Every single one." For the first time in months, Bill smiled. About 3 months later, in the spring of 1996, Bill, along with his wife Rhoda and his daughters Jocelyn and Hillary, were all clustered together on the couch in Bill's room at the Ohio Doctors Hospital. Bill looked out his window at the Columbus skyline, and he inhaled deeply. He was breathing better than he had in years, and the scabs on his arms were finally beginning to heal. He felt healthy enough to get out of bed and sit with his family and carry on an actual conversation. Bill knew these improvements were all thanks to Dr. Lin. When he began treating Bill, one of the first things Dr. Lin suggested was a new diet. The chyle leaking into his abdomen contained fats and proteins, so Dr. Lin told him he would need to eat a fat-free, low-protein diet. Dr. Lin's hope was this would make his body produce less chyle. It had only taken a few weeks on this new diet for Bill to start to feel a difference. His gut was still hard and rounded, but he could now breathe better, and he also did not have to have the fluids drained from his chest as often. Bill breathed out and told his wife and children that soon enough he'd be healthy enough to go for a walk downtown. And as he dreamed about leaving the hospital for good, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Lin came inside and told the family he had a big announcement. He had solved Bill's medical mystery. Bill and his family all sat up, anxious to hear what the doctor had to say. Dr. Lin said he'd been investigating Bill's illness using a brand new tool called the Internet. He'd spent hours searching for people with symptoms similar to Bill's, and eventually he found a family in Turkey with a condition that seemed identical. They'd been diagnosed with a rare disorder called Behçet's disease. Behçet's disease causes blood vessels throughout the body to swell. This leads to bodily fluids like blood and lymph not being able to circulate properly, and one potential symptom is lymphedema, just like Bill and his relatives had experienced. Bill couldn't believe it. He asked the doctor what this diagnosis meant. Was his disease treatable? Would he and his daughters be okay? Dr. Lin nodded. He said that while Behçet's disease was rare and poorly understood, the treatment couldn't be simpler. All Bill needed were steroid injections, and he'd be good as new. Bill jumped out of his hospital bed, an IV still attached to one arm. He threw his arms around his daughters, he kissed his wife over and over, and he let tears of joy roll down his cheeks. Finally, he was going to be okay again. The following night, Bill was lying in his hospital bed looking at the dark sky through his window. Dr. Lin had given him a steroid injection, and he felt hopeful that the treatment would work. But suddenly, Bill felt a sharp pain in his chest, and the whole room went black. 2 days later, Bill woke up. The light in his hospital room seemed blindingly bright. As his vision focused, he saw Dr. Lin standing at the foot of his bed. The doctor's eyebrows were knitted together, and his lips were pressed into a frown. The doctor told Bill he'd gone into cardiac arrest. The hospital had been able to resuscitate him, but the emergency made one thing clear. Dr. Lin had been wrong. Bill did not have Behçet's disease, and steroids were not going to cure him. If anything, they could have made his condition worse. Bill was stunned. He'd almost died, and now he was also back to square one with a mystery disease that no one knew how to treat that also might kill him. In that moment, he suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of absolute hopelessness. 6 months later, in September of 1996, Bill's daughter Jocelyn was writing on a yellow pad working on a term paper. After spending her early college years partying and skipping class, she was now committed to getting her life together and finishing her degree. Plus, focusing on school helped her ignore the things that made her the most anxious, the knowledge that she might one day develop the same disease that was killing her father. As she scrawled on her paper, Jocelyn's phone rang. She picked it up, and she heard her mother's strained voice on the other end. She said Jocelyn's father had been placed into a medically induced coma. Jocelyn's mother explained that doctors were no longer able to drain that chyle from her father's chest and abdomen. He just had way too much scar tissue built up from years of undergoing the tapping procedure. And so now the fluid buildup was putting immense pressure on his internal organs, and they were failing one by one. Jocelyn felt tears building in the corner of her eyes. She asked her mom if this meant her father was going to die. After a moment, her mother said yes. Jocelyn swallowed hard. Her father had never lost hope that his doctors would be able to identify his condition and find a cure, but they didn't. Jocelyn wanted to start sobbing, but she did know there was one hidden blessing. Her father's suffering would finally be over. And sure enough, just a few days later, on September 25th, Bill would die. Seven years later, in 2003, 28-year-old Jocelyn was walking towards the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, California. After her father passed away in September of 1996, Jocelyn had moved far away to California, but the trauma of her father's slow, painful decline followed her wherever she went. She was acutely aware that she might meet the same fate. It was also very hard for Jocelyn to forget that she had not been there during her father's last moments. She'd flown to Columbus and gone to the hospital, but when her dad actually drew his last breath, Jocelyn had been outside smoking a cigarette. Jocelyn had a lot of regrets and painful memories. The only thing that brought her any real solace were these long walks, when she could breathe in the summer air and organize her thoughts. Jocelyn found a nice spot to sit on the bridge where she could look through the red bars to the sparkling water down below. She crossed her legs, and as she did, she noticed that one of her ankles looked much larger than the other. It had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Jocelyn remembered how her father's legs and ankles began to swell just a few years before he got really sick, but she tried not to panic. She told herself that her ankle was just aggravated from the long walk, and so she went back home that day, and sure enough, the swelling went down. But a few days later, she was at her apartment getting ready to go on another walk, and her foot and ankle were so swollen that she couldn't even get her shoe on. Jocelyn knew she could not ignore the swelling any longer, so she went to her small desk, turned on her computer, and opened up her email. She typed in Dr. Christine Seidman's address and wrote her a message asking if she should be worried about the swelling in her legs. Jocelyn finally got a response the next day. Dr. Seidman didn't say whether or not she should be worried. Instead, she offered to fly Jocelyn out to her lab near Boston. She said that in the 7 years since Jocelyn's father had passed away, she had not stopped researching her family's mystery illness, and she'd recently made a breakthrough that she wanted to tell Jocelyn about in person. The idea of going back to Boston made Jocelyn feel really nervous. She hadn't been there since her dad died. But this was very important, and so she responded to Dr. Seidman with a yes, and immediately began packing her bags. A few days later, Jocelyn walked into the tall red brick building that housed the Seidman Laboratory. She went inside and introduced herself to one of Dr. Seidman's research assistants, a young, dark-haired woman. As soon as Jocelyn said her name, the research assistant beamed. She told Jocelyn that she was so excited to see her. Jocelyn was really taken aback. She didn't even realize that the researchers would know who she was. Just then, Dr. Seidman rounded a corner and said hello, looking happier than Jocelyn had ever seen her before. Jocelyn followed her into the back of the lab, trailed by the cheerful assistant, and they all sat down in the cluttered room while Jocelyn looked back and forth at the two women, a little uneasy at how excited they both seemed. Before she could even ask what was going on, Dr. Seidman told her. She and her team had used a technology that had only just been developed, and at last, they had found the cause of her family's mysterious disease. Dr. Seidman had been painstakingly creating a map of Bill Linder's genes so that she could find anything that looked out of the ordinary. But there are hundreds of thousands of genes in every individual person, and Dr. Seidman had to build her map one by one. That's why her research had taken so long. But finally, they'd found an extremely rare mutation of a single gene that had caused Bill's illness. It was a lot like finding a needle in a haystack. The chances of a single defective gene leading to such a debilitating illness were about 1 in a billion. Even more surprisingly, Dr. Seidman concluded that no one in the world outside of the Linder family carried this mutation. Dr. Seidman discovered that the genetic mutation began with Jocelyn's great-great-grandmother, Esther, who first showed symptoms of the disease roughly 100 years earlier. That made Esther what disease trackers call patient zero, the first patient with a brand new disease. Since Esther, this mysterious condition had been passed down 5 generations. Once Dr. Seidman found this genetic defect, suddenly Bill's illness made more sense. The mutation stopped his liver from being able to properly filter toxins out of his blood, and from there, it caused a cascade of serious problems, including the chronic swelling and the chyle buildup in his chest and abdomen. Lastly, the genetic mutation also appeared to cause the family's telltale heart murmur. Jocelyn was on the edge of her seat as she heard all this. She asked Dr. Seidman if now they'd be able to cure her, her sister, and her other relatives who had likely inherited this disease. But Dr. Seidman shook her head sadly. She said while this was a huge discovery, many questions still remained. I mean, at this point, they didn't even have a name for this disease, and so they really had no way to treat or cure it, at least not yet. Jocelyn felt totally deflated. Even though they had just figured out what was behind the family's deadly illness, there was nothing she could do about it. Over the last 20 years, Jocelyn has come to terms with her diagnosis. Because the risk of passing on her deadly genetic variant was so high, Jocelyn and her husband chose not to have kids. Her older sister Hillary opted to use a form of in vitro fertilization that allowed her to have twins who were both free from the family disease. Right now, in the 6th and newest generation of the Linder family, there are 23 children. But due to advances in fertility treatment, none of these new generation kids have the genetic mutation. The Linders were able to stop the spread of their family illness. Today, there are 7 members of the Linder family who do carry the genetic mutation who are still alive. Dr. Seidman and her team continue to research their illness in hopes of someday finding a cure. On April 15, 2018, a 56-year-old woman named Yoshika Yasutake began dusting a piano inside of her family's very small and very clean home in the English village of Helmsley. Like she always did, after dusting the outside of this piano, Yoshika lifted up the lid and began individually dusting each of the piano keys. But as she did this, she was very careful not to press down accidentally on any of the keys and make a sound. That was the last thing she wanted to do. Every time Yoshika was in charge of cleaning the house, she always dreaded getting to the piano because she was so worried about making a sound. After Yoshika had finished dusting this piano, both outside and inside, she lowered the lid and then walked over to a bookcase right next to a window and began dusting each of the books. And as she did, she began to hear out the window the sounds of birds chirping and cars driving around and people chatting. And Yoshika, when she heard this, she stopped dusting for a moment and just looked out the window at the beautiful town, all the little stone cottages that lined the road. And as she looked out there and listened to the sounds of her village, Yoshika was struck with a sadness about all the things that she was missing out on. Once, Yoshika had been a world-class pianist. She had trained at the Royal College of Music, which is one of the most prestigious institutions in London, and she used to play packed symphony halls where sometimes in the audience would be literal members of the royal family. I mean, she was a really big deal. But Yoshika didn't play the piano anymore because her younger sister, Rina, had come back home. Now, as soon as Yoshika thought of Rina, she got angry and instinctively just turned and stared at Rina's closed bedroom door. And just for a moment, Yoshika wished that Rina had not come home. Because ever since Rina had come home, it was like all of Yoshika's family had decided that nothing else was important. Rina was the only thing that mattered. The Yasutake family consisted of Yoshika, as well as, of course, Rina, who was 49 years old, and they both had a brother who was 51 years old, and his name was Takahiro, and the 3 siblings' mother also lived with them, and she was 80 years old. As for their dad, he had passed away a few years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were both very impressive in their own ways. Yoshika had been this amazing pianist, and Takahiro was this amazing writer, but Rina was just on another level. Rina not only spoke fluent Greek, Latin, English, and Japanese, but she also created her own dialect of Japanese with a complete system of grammar. Rina was also this unbelievable artist, and everybody wanted to buy her paintings, but Rina would never sell, or if she did, it was quite rare, but that only created lots of hype around her artwork. It was like so valuable to get your hands on one of Rina's paintings. As a child, Rina had been awarded all these scholarships to all these prestigious private schools, and then after graduating high school, she was given a full-ride scholarship to the University of Cambridge, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And so everybody assumed Rina was on track to become this world-famous artist. But there was something dark inside of Rina that no one could quite place. It only came out when she would have these sudden outbursts of anger, and people would see this side of her that just didn't line up with the rest of who she was. But these flashes of anger would often pass quickly, and so people kind of wrote it off as a byproduct of extreme genius. It was like her brain just sometimes couldn't quite handle how smart she was, and she would get mad and frustrated. But when Rina graduated from the University of Cambridge and came back home, she just was totally different. It was like something inside of her had snapped and stayed broken. A couple of days after Rina had come home, she had one of those sudden outbursts of anger, but Rina's anger never went away. She just stayed mad for days and days, and her family began asking her, like, what has gotten you so upset? But Rina refused to talk about it. And eventually, Rina just locked herself in her bedroom in the family home, and she would stay inside of there, refusing to talk to her family for weeks. And then when she did finally emerge after several weeks, it was clear Rina was just different. She basically refused to speak to anyone, family included, unless it was absolutely necessary, and she really never left the house or even her room unless it was totally necessary. And it would turn out this was not some post-college phase Rina was going through. This would become Rina's life. She basically became a total recluse inside of that bedroom for decades, to the point where the family's neighbors didn't even know Rina existed because she basically never came out of the house. Yoshika stopped staring at her sister's closed bedroom door and turned her attention back to the books on the shelf. She finished dusting them, and then after she was done cleaning the house, and so she put the duster down, and Yoshika very quietly tiptoed her way over to Rina's closed bedroom door, and very quietly she knocked. Rina hated loud noises, which is why Yoshika was no longer allowed to play the piano, because it was too loud for Rina. After Yoshika gave this light knock, she began counting in her head to 30 because Rina had told her, you do not come in right away. You knock and you wait 30 seconds at least, and then maybe I'll let you come inside. And so Yoshika, she's counting in her head, 1, 2, 3. She gets to 25, 26, 27. And then from inside the room, Rina would tell Yoshika, okay, you're allowed to enter. Yoshika very slowly reached down, she turned the knob and opened up her sister's bedroom door, and it revealed this totally dark room, this very small, cramped space. All the shades and blinds had been drawn, and Rina was sitting on her bed, completely silent. And Yoshika, she kept her head down, being very careful not to make eye contact with Rina. She didn't want to upset her. And Yoshika, she walked into the room, she made her way to the table, and she scooped up all of Rina's dirty dishes. And then Yoshika, she turned around and began walking out again. And as she did, she tried to take a quick glimpse at whatever Rina was working on in her bedroom. Because Rina had told her family that she was working on this master work, but wouldn't really elaborate on it. And in order to work on this thing, she needed the room to be dark and the house to be silent, and she needed to focus exclusively on this master work, and the family needed to support her as she did this. But again, Rina just never really elaborated on what this masterwork was. She would just say that it was very special, and it would combine all the elements of her life, her spirit, her body, her soul. Even the family would be a part of building this masterwork. And when her family asked her, well, what do you mean? How can we support you in making this masterwork? Rina would just say, oh, you'll know when the time is right. Yoshika couldn't get a glimpse of the masterwork, and so she quickly turned her head back down to the ground and shuffled her way out of Rina's room and shut the door behind her. And then Yoshika, she went to the kitchen and she dumped Rina's dishes in the sink, which was totally clean to begin with, because one of Rina's rules was the house must always be immaculately clean, no dirty dish, no dust anywhere. I mean, it had to be perfect, spotless at all times, because that's the only way Rina could work on this master work. And so as Yoshika cleaned and dried off all of Rina's dishes and began putting them away, her brother Takahiro walked into the kitchen, and he would say to Yoshika that it was time for them to leave the house and go to the market and buy some supplies for Rina so she can continue to work on this master work. Yoshika was immediately totally annoyed that they had to go do this because everything was all about Rina, but she kind of buried those feelings and told her brother, okay, sure, let's go. Takahiro was different than Yoshika in how he thought about their younger sister, Rina. Yoshika totally resented Rina because now that Rina was home, Yoshika basically had to give up her career as this amazing pianist in order to support Rina in this whole master work she was working on. But Takahiro, he was totally fine giving up his writing career to just focus on supporting Rina. because he really believed in Rina, and he thought that this master work she was building was going to be like the single greatest piece of art in the history of humankind. And so Takahiro felt proud to kind of be a part of it. Now, Takahiro, like the rest of his family, had no idea what this masterwork actually was, but Takahiro and Rina had a much better relationship than Yoshika and Rina, and so Rina would tell Takahiro the specific things that she needed in order to build this masterwork. And so that day, Rina had told Takahiro some things she needed, and so he and Yoshika were going to go out and get them. So Takahiro and Yoshika threw on their jackets and stepped outside, and as soon as they were out there, they both flipped their collars up and kind of concealed their faces and put their heads down because they were very careful not to make eye contact with other people. This family was already very private, but with Rina, they had been instructed to be even more private and not even really interact with the outside world. And so basically, anytime they went out in public, they would kind of hide themselves. And so Yoshika and Takahiro, they made their way to the pharmacy, they ducked their way inside, and they would purchase a bottle of surgical spirits, which is sort of like a medical alcohol. And then after buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up, headed back outside, and they went to an old used bookstore, and they bought a book on palm reading, which is the art of studying the lines on your hands in order to tell someone's future. And when the brother and sister bought this book, even though the cashier was talking to them, they kept their heads down and didn't say a word to the cashier. And then after getting their book, the brother and sister hurried their way back home. And when they got there, the door was locked. But instead of pulling out a key and unlocking the door of their own home, the brother and sister knocked and they waited. And then at some point, their mother came to the door and they heard 4 locks turning. The door opened up. And then Yoshika and Takahiro walked inside and they shut the door and then locked again the 4 deadbolts. Rina was adamant that no one in the family could carry around a key to the house. It was too dangerous because they could potentially lose the key in town and then someone could come into their house and potentially see Rina's master work, and they couldn't have that happen. And so nobody had keys. They had to knock each time they came home. And the reason they had 4 locks on the door was, again, because Rina was very worried about somebody coming into this house and seeing what she was doing. Yoshika carried the bag with the supplies inside of it, the surgical spirits and the palm reading book, over to Rina's closed bedroom door. And instead of knocking, Yoshika just placed the bag right outside the door. She turned around and began walking away. And then as she did, she heard the sound of Rina's door opening just a crack. And Yoshika, she quickly turned around and she saw a tiny skinny arm reach out from behind the door. It grabbed the bag and then pulled the bag back into the room, and the door shut and locked. Three days later, on April 18th, 2018, Yoshika was sitting in the kitchen reading a book when she overheard her brother, Takahiro, chatting with Rina. Now, Takahiro and Rina were not facing each other in the same room talking. Rina was still in her bedroom, her door was closed, and Takahiro was outside of her bedroom, and he was just sitting on the ground with his back to the door, talking through the door to Rina. Now, this was not unusual because unlike Yoshika and Rina, who did not have a good relationship and who really didn't talk at all, Takahiro and Rina did have a good relationship, and they would do this fairly often. They would chat through the door for like hours at a time. And so for a minute, Yoshika kind of ignored her brother and sister chatting and focused again on her book. But at some point, she began hearing what her brother was saying, and it was just totally weird. And so she put her book down and just began listening to Takahiro. And what he was saying was, how can you do that? That doesn't make any sense. How? Only your soul? How? Yoshika sensed that her brother was confused and maybe upset about something, and so she couldn't help herself. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room and looked down at her brother to see if he would kind of give her some indication of what was going on. But when Takahiro looked up and saw Yoshika, he and Rina stopped talking, and Takahiro just shook his head, stood up, and walked away. After Takahiro was gone, Yoshika very quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door, and just out of curiosity, she pressed her ear up against the wood and tried to listen to see if she could maybe hear Rina and catch something she was saying that would begin to explain what she had just overheard. But all she heard was the sound of Rina slowly shuffling towards the back of her bedroom where her bed was, and then it was totally silent. And so Yoshika moved away from the door and went back into the kitchen, and she sat down to read again, but she couldn't focus on the book because it was like this wave of sadness was just coming over her. And the reason Yoshika was feeling this way is she was thinking about the fact that back in the day when she was a kid, her and Rina used to be as close as sisters could possibly be, and for much of their lives, they were very close. Even after Rina began this kind of reclusive lifestyle, they still, were friends, they interacted. But something happened in 2013, 5 years earlier, that totally severed their relationship for good. On that day, Rina had emerged from her bedroom, and Yoshika offered to read Rina's palm. This was something the two sisters did for each other periodically. It was like a way for them to bond. And so Rina held out her hand, and Yoshika took it, and she began tracing a long horizontal line across her palm. Now, Rina's hands were different than most people's hands. Rina had something called a simian line, which is a very rare thing on people's palms. It's like this long horizontal line that runs the length of your hand. In palm reading, a simian line can be either very good or very bad. It can indicate that the person is a visionary or a mystic, so that's the good side, or it can indicate that this person has a terrible disease or they're very aggressive, so that's the bad side. Rina knew she had the simian line, and she believed that it represented something good. She would say that she had a visionary soul. But on this particular day in 2013, the family had recently been banned from a local supermarket because Rina had actually gone to this market and gotten really upset with some staff members and totally lost her cool and screamed and yelled at them, and so they had been banned. And so Yoshika, thinking about this, she's looking at Rina's palm and she goes, "Oh, the simian line. Maybe this is why you were acting so aggressive at the supermarket. Maybe this means you're an aggressive person." But after Yoshika said this, Rina was so offended that she whipped her hand back and began screaming and yelling at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, "You don't understand the vision that I have. I'm going to show the world someday this vision, and you and those idiots down at the grocery store would never understand." And then Rina began beating and punching and kicking Yoshika, and Yoshika's screaming and trying to protect herself. And then Takahiro, the brother, had to run in and separate the two of them. Now, even though Rina was prone to these angry outbursts, this was the first time that she had lashed out physically, and so Rina's mother was concerned that Rina had some underlying condition that was causing her to lash out physically, and so she sent Rina to the doctor, and the doctor would say, there is no underlying condition that led to this. However, it seems pretty clear that Rina is having some kind of psychological breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment, maybe even hospitalization. But Rina had totally rejected this, refused to get treatment, and blamed everything on Yoshika. And then after that, Rina really stopped leaving her bedroom. She left like once every couple of months before that, but now she basically stayed in there 24/7. And at the same time, Rina had added all these new rules that her family now needed to follow to allow Rina to be able to focus on her master work while she was in her bedroom. And that included no one having house keys and adding those 4 locks to the door. Also, the family was told to learn the new dialect of Japanese that Rina had created. This way, no one would ever understand what they were talking about. It would kind of protect them even more from the evils of the outside world. Also, Rina made sure her family got rid of all of their telephones, their TVs, and their computers. And so Yoshika would sit in the kitchen for a bit longer, thinking about how sad it was that she had lost this relationship with her sister. And, Yoshika had a lot of regret about what she had said about the simian line. But eventually, like always, Yoshika just kind of pushed her feelings for Rina down. And before long, Yoshika was back to reading her book. For the next several weeks, Yoshika would see her brother, Takahiro, sitting up against the door to Rina's bedroom more often than usual, having these kind of hushed conversations through the door with Rina. Also, Yoshika began to notice that Takahiro was now cooking all of Rina's meals. Normally, their mother was the one who cooked Rina's food, but now Takahiro seemed to have taken over that task entirely. As for Yoshika, because she was primarily in charge of being the one to constantly clean the house, that meant she was the one going into Rina's bedroom and collecting her dirty dishes. And as soon as Takahiro had begun being the cook for Rina, Yoshika began to notice that more and more food was being left on Rina's plates. Basically, Rina wasn't eating as much food as she normally did, and this started to worry Yoshika. Rina was already a very small person. She was 4 foot 11 inches tall, barely 90 pounds. And Yoshika worried that, she really needs to eat. She's already so small, she can't afford to miss meals. And then one day in the middle of May, Yoshika went into Rina's bedroom and she saw all of her dishes were basically completely filled with the food she had been given. She basically had not touched them. And Yoshika, she really never actually spoke to Rina when she was in the bedroom. But this time she just couldn't help herself. And without even looking at Rina, Yoshika, she gathered up the plates full of food and she said, "Rina, you need to eat more of your food." Rina didn't say anything back. And Yoshika, she just quickly turned and walked out of the room. But after that interaction, Takahiro would tell Yoshika that Rina doesn't want you going in her room ever again. And so from now on, the dishes that you would normally collect, Rina will place them right outside of the door. That way, you don't have to go inside that room. Also, around the same time, Rina, who normally would only leave her bedroom to go use the bathroom, well, she began going to the bathroom exclusively at night when her family was asleep to avoid any interaction with them. And so by this point, Rina's interactions with her family were reduced to basically zero. By early August, Takahiro and Yoshika were being sent to the store more and more often by Rina to get more of these surgical spirits, the medical alcohol. Now, neither Takahiro nor Yoshika had any idea what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they knew it was their duty to support her, and so they kept buying them, and what they would do is they would come back home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door, and he would tuck the bottle inside, and then Rina would take it, the door would shut, and then Rina would never give them her empty bottle. Basically, the bottle went in, and it stayed inside. Then, on August 18th of 2018, Takahiro and Rina appeared to get in some kind of a fight. Yoshika was in the kitchen and she saw that Takahiro was sitting against the door of Rina's bedroom and the two were having kind of a hushed conversation. And then at some point, Takahiro stood up and he turned around and faced the door and kind of yelled into it, "I told you your soul was not enough." And then Rina said something back to him, at which point Takahiro said, "No, please, please," as if he was kind of begging with Rina to change her mind. And then before Yoshika could come over and ask Takahiro what was going on, Takahiro just opened up Rina's bedroom door and walked inside, and suddenly the house went completely silent. Yoshika was too nervous to walk over and look inside of the room, and so she just stayed in the kitchen and listened. And for 15 minutes, it was absolute silence. And then Takahiro walked out of Rina's bedroom, shut the door behind him, and he looked very calm. And at this point, Yoshika looked over at him and said, "What's going on?" And Takahiro, he would just smile and tell Yoshika that Rina's masterwork is nearly completed. And then Takahiro asked Yoshika if she remembered when Rina had said, at some point her masterwork was going to require some direct help from the family, but she said, we'll know when the time is right for us to participate. And Yoshika would say, "Yes, I remember that." And Takahiro said, "Well, the time is now." Then Takahiro told Yoshika that they had to go to the store and get more surgical spirits. And so really without questioning him, Yoshika went with him. They went to the store and they would purchase 3 times the normal amount of surgical spirits that they normally would. And then when they got home, Takahiro alone would go into Rina's bedroom with these surgical spirits. He would shut the door behind him and Yoshika just sat in the kitchen for about 10 minutes until Takahiro came out again, no longer carrying these surgical spirits. And he would come over to Yoshika and he would say, "Rina is ready to reconcile with you. She wants you to sit by the door and talk to her. And if you do that, you can be more involved in creating her masterwork." And at this news, Yoshika felt a mixture of frustration and relief. She had never thought it was fair that Rina had so completely cut her off after that 2013 simian line joke she made while palm reading. Also, Rina had made Yoshika's life so difficult for so long. I mean, Yoshika had basically been forced to give up her dreams of playing the piano, and she had to give up her friends and all of her life ambitions and goals to just support Rina. But despite all of that, deep down, Yoshika missed Rina terribly. They did used to be so close. She wanted to have that relationship again. And so Yoshika walked over to Rina's closed bedroom door. She sat down against it, and at first, she didn't say anything. and Rina didn't say anything either. But then at some point, it was like the floodgates just opened, and Yoshika kind of began pouring her heart out about how sad she was, about how her and Rina's relationship had really gone south and how she wanted to fix it. And now normally, on the rare times that Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it up to drop something off or whatever it was, oftentimes Rina would just start banging on something inside of the room, kind of to tell Yoshika to stop talking and go away. But as Yoshika sat there pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, the one thing Yoshika noticed was there was no pounding coming from inside the room. Rina was listening to her. And then the next day, after Yoshika and Takahiro had gone to the store again and gotten more surgical spirits and brought them back to the house, instead of just Takahiro being allowed to enter Rina's bedroom, this time Yoshika was allowed to join. And so Takahiro and Yoshika, they went into the dark bedroom and Rina was laying on the bed and they walked over to her and Takahiro showed Yoshika what they needed to do. It was the last step of this masterwork project that Rina was working on. They basically needed to rub these surgical spirits all over Rina's body. Now, Yoshika didn't really understand why they were doing this, but she respected that this was part of Rina's plan, and frankly, Yoshika was just happy to be included in creating this masterwork, and so she didn't really ask any questions. And so after the brother and sister had rubbed this alcohol all over Rina for about 10 minutes, they walked back outside, they shut the door, and then Yoshika, she stayed back and sat down against the door and kind of poured her heart out again to Rina. And it was just very therapeutic. And in many ways, this was the first time that Yoshika was feeling happy again. I mean, she was finally starting to repair this relationship with Rina. And so over the next several weeks, this became Yoshika's new daily routine. Her and her brother would get all these surgical spirits, they'd come home, they'd rub them all over Rina, and then over the course of the day, Yoshika would stop by the door and chat with Rina through it, and that was it. And then on September 25th, 2018, after Yoshika and Takahiro had applied these surgical spirits to Rina's body, Yoshika told Rina that she had a very special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a really good mood this day because one, she was feeling really good about her new relationship with her sister, but also two, when she had gone to the pharmacy earlier with her brother, normally they didn't have any interaction with the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits, mostly because Yoshika and her brother did their best to kind of like hide themselves and make it very clear they were not looking to talk. But on this particular day, the pharmacist had been very talkative and was trying to talk to Yoshika, and Yoshika, she decided she would talk back. Now, their conversation was not very substantive. Basically, the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, why are you buying all these surgical spirits? And Yoshika would say, oh, they're for my sister Rina, and, she needs more and more of them every day, and, she's working on something special, and we don't really know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know whatever she's doing, it's going to be worth it. And so even though this conversation seems kind of meaningless, for Yoshika, who had virtually no contact with other people, it was great having that little talk. And so when she came home, she just felt ready to do something special for Rina. And so after Yoshika and Takahiro had left Rina's bedroom after applying these surgical spirits, Yoshika went to go give Rina her surprise. And so Yoshika, she walked over to the family piano that was not far from Rina's bedroom door. And Yoshika, she was nervous, but she sat down on the bench and she opened up the lid and she placed her fingers on the keys. Yoshika's big surprise was she was going to play a song called The Waltz of the Flowers, which is a famous piece of classical music that was inspired by the composer's love for his sister. And so Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to finally play in this house for Rina. She'll see that I love her so much. And so Yoshika, she began to play the song, and as she did, she was constantly listening to see if Rina would start banging on something to tell Yoshika to stop. But again, she didn't. It was quiet, and so Yoshika, she played this beautiful song, and then when it was all over, again, Yoshika's listening carefully for Rina to yell out or be mad that she's playing this loud music in the house, but it was just quiet. And so again, Yoshika just felt this closeness to her sister, and before long, Yoshika felt tears of happiness coming down her cheeks. But then, as Yoshika closed the lid of the piano, she did hear a banging, but it wasn't coming from Rina's bedroom, it was coming from the front door. And then a moment later, Yoshika heard someone scream from outside the front door, "Police, open up!" But before Yoshika could go to the door to open it, her mother had ran to the door, she opened all 4 locks, but then only opened it a crack and tried to yell at the police to go away, go away. But the police, they were kind of pushing on the door, trying to get the mother to get out of the way. And Yoshika, she kind of moved over and looked through the crack. And she saw it wasn't just a couple of police officers. It was a whole army of police officers and firefighters and EMTs. There was an ambulance. And then before long, the police officer that had been yelling, open up, he finally just pushed and got the door open all the way. And then a swarm of people in uniforms flooded the home. And as soon as all these officers were in the house, they immediately began opening up every door like they were looking for something. And then finally they got to Rina's bedroom and they opened the door. And as soon as they did, Yoshika watched as the officers just stopped at the doorway and they began cussing and yelling and turning their faces away. And then the officers went into Rina's bedroom, and then a minute later, they began talking on their radio, and then EMTs came into the house with a stretcher. They went into Rina's bedroom, and then before long, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched as the stretcher came out again with these officers and EMTs, and on the stretcher was Rina, and she looked terrible. Her eyes were sunken back in her head, and her skin was so pale it was practically see-through. I mean, really, she just kind of looked like a skeleton. The real story of what happened inside of that family's home would quickly become international news. And not because Rina was secretly creating a masterwork of art in her bedroom. Here's what really happened. Rina stopped eating food in April of 2018. She would say that the only thing she needed to be nourished was her visionary soul. And so basically, because she had this visionary soul, she didn't need food. That was the conversation that Yoshika had overheard between Takahiro and Rina when Takahiro was saying, "Only your soul? How? Well, he was trying to figure out how Rina was going to survive by being nourished by her soul. It didn't make any sense. Fast forward 4 months to August 18th, and again, Yoshika had overheard her brother and her sister talking through the bedroom door, except on this day, it sounded like Takahiro was fighting with Rina, because at some point he had stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul wasn't enough!" And then he had busted inside of Rina's bedroom and stayed in there in silence for 15 minutes, only to come back out again and very calmly tell Yoshika that, "Don't worry, Rina is nearing the end of her master work, and we just need to go out and get her more surgical spirits." Well, it would turn out the reason Takahiro was mad and yelled through the door at Rina is because he was trying to talk to her through the door and she wasn't talking back. And he suspected it was because she wasn't eating, and so he had yelled at her about that and then barged into her room only to find Rina totally unresponsive, not moving, not talking, nothing. And so he just stood there wondering what to do. And so as Takahiro is standing there, it clicks for him that now is the time. Now's the time to get involved. And so Takahiro left the bedroom, he grabbed Yoshika, they went to the pharmacy, they got more surgical spirits, they came back, and Takahiro alone went into Rina's bedroom and covered her head to toe in these spirits, because that was something she had wanted him to do before, and he believed that that's what she needed right now, because she can't talk, she can't move, she needs more of these spirits. That's going to help her visionary soul nourish her while she completes this master work. And for the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika would continue to apply these spirits to Rina's body, believing they were helping her complete her master work. On September 25th, when Yoshika and Takahiro were at the pharmacy getting more spirits, the reason this pharmacist finally struck up a conversation with Yoshika is because over time, the pharmacist had noticed that every time they came in to buy these surgical spirits, they smelled so bad. And on this particular day, when they came in, the stench was just overwhelming. And so the pharmacist finally had asked Yoshika, what are these surgical spirits for? And Yoshika would give this totally weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister and she was working on this master work in her bedroom and it was all going to be worth it. And so when Yoshika and Takahiro had left that day, the pharmacist was just so weirded out and alarmed by them that he called the police. And when the police arrived at the family's home, they discovered that Rina was not building a masterwork in her bedroom, she was just dead in her bed, and had been for 6 weeks. Rina died around August 18th, which is the day that Takahiro came into the room and discovered her unresponsive, which meant there was never any reconciliation happening between Yoshika and Rina. It's unclear why Takahiro had told Yoshika, hey, Rina's ready to reconcile with you, because again, Rina was dead at the time, so there's no way she would have said anything to him. And so when Yoshika was having these supposed heart-to-hearts through the door with her sister or playing music for her, that wasn't real. The only real thing that was happening is Yoshika and Takahiro, from August 18th until the end of September when the police busted into their home, they would spend nearly every day rubbing this weird medical alcohol all over their dead sister's body because that's what they believed she wanted, when in reality, all this alcohol was doing was actually mummifying her body. Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother were all charged with preventing a proper and decent burial. As for Rina, her cause of death could not actually be determined, but based on what she looked like, they assumed she died from starvation. The court would eventually drop the charges against the family, saying that basically the family was too mentally ill to stand trial, and this was because the court had discovered that Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother actually had not accepted that Rina was dead. They believed she was actually still alive, that all the work they had done rubbing those spirits on her had nourished her soul, and she was still working on this master work. And as of a few years ago, the family is still living in that same cottage, and it's not clear if they ever actually came to understand that Rina was in fact dead. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your